record for the people at home so they can get caught up too and share the screen. We're going to wrap this up pretty quickly, but when I assign a new study guide, every time I assign a new study guide, I'm going to make sure that I put the points in. So let's go ahead and go to yours. Here we go, history. And so everything's got to be done by December 11th, 2020, which is a week from Friday. So this is really important. So you'll have another study guide next week covering lectures 29 to 31. We'll try to give you that on Monday so that you can have, and Wednesday of next week, not this week, but next week will be a study day only so that you can get all the work done and meet the end of the semester, which is the 11th. Now, I'm deliberately planning this in such a way so that you can then be done with my class on the last day of the semester, and then you can focus on any finals that you have the next week in other classes. Again, I know my place in the list of important classes here. Astronomy's got to be first if you have that, your math, and then your biology, and all these classes really matter. So my class is important, but not quite as important as some of those. So I'm clearing the decks. If you have all your study guides done, then you're good to go. Now, some of you are going to have a decision to make. I'm going to put zeros in for this study guide as soon as I post it. And a few of you are going to have grades that are going to be A's already. So those that have worked hard and done well on all their study guides and gotten mostly all the right answers may not, I can't guarantee this, but may not have to do this last one. So that's a real gift to them, those that have worked hard and finished up well. And for the rest, if you just keep finishing study guides until you're all caught up, you may be able to drop one as well. But it will be dependent on, the quality of the work on all of them. So that'll be a decision safe till next week. Just get all caught up, and then you can look at this last study guide and say, yeah, maybe I don't have to do it. If I got 97%, I got an A, not going to change, then study for another class. That's what you have to do in college. You have to balance your schedule. If you already have an A in one class, and focus on another. Just make sure you don't, leave it to chance. So I want everybody to know exactly what their grades are going to be next Monday, and then you can decide your plan forward. Does that make sense? Raise your hand if you understood what I just told you. All right, cool. All right, well, you're doing really well, and your study guides, you're just doing a great job putting the answers in and so on. This one, I've had two people do the alternative on the vaccine as opposed to answering the questions on Rome. Most are doing the questions on Rome like normally. But it is an option for those that want to look at that issue. And so that's kind of important. All right, well, enough of that. Let's get back to then the last three lectures, which is how Rome collapses, and we go into the medieval period of history, right? So to go back to our periodization, here we go. Remember, we kind of started showing how the modern age came about with the voyages of Da Gama and Columbus, and how that led to modern society. See, modern world history is about 500 years old. Okay, modern history, it's 500 years old. Yeah, a lot of people in modern history think, well, since World War II, right? That would be ultra modern history. Modern history, the kinds of countries and societies that we experience today really are about 400 to 500 years old. And the way we get our food, the way we get products and ship them around the world on big ships coming from China, carrying all the things that we want for Christmas, that all started with those first voyages across the Atlantic and into the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific by those early explorers. It's kind of what started it all. So we've tried, to look at then how prehistory influenced that, and then how ancient history influenced that, and how the classical world influenced us probably more than any other time period. But now we're going into what some people like to call the Dark Ages. Well, historians hate that term. We basically go, Dark Ages? Look, sun still came up. They still made some progress, for example, in architecture. Some of the cathedrals that were built in Western Europe, for example, were just amazing. Society continued to progress. It's just that it wasn't like the Roman Empire where you had this Pax Romana and you had all this sharing and trade and all this. It was much more localized little efforts in what we call medieval society, where you had a rich and powerful warlord type person. Sometimes they were called a king or a prince or a nobleman who ruled over the land, and people living there kind of had to do their will. And so it was different. It was very different from the classical world and very different from modern society. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at this. The crisis, of course, from Rome took place in the 3rd century, where they had external invasion, internal civil war, and an economic collapse because of the invasions. We talked about these different groups, for example, right? One later one would be called the Gauls, who would come across here and establish a beachhead, so to speak, in what we call Poland. But by the time they're done, the Gauls are going to take over half of Europe, right? The area of modern Germany. We talked about the Vandals. We talked about all of these things. Well, one guy tried to halt the decay, and his name was Diocletian. And Diocletian, in the crisis of the 3rd century, kind of ended that crisis for a time. And he set up an autocratic government, which means he was the only absolute ruler and everybody kind of had to do what he said. And he was a good ruler. So he was responsible for laying the foundation for the next period of history, where the barbarian invasions are coming across the Rhine River. How do you deal with all of this? And part of it was picking good rulers, right? I mean, how do you do that? We know that heredity doesn't work, father to son, father to son. Sometimes the son's not, a little nuts like Nero or Caligula, or, it's one of those examples. The earlier emperors preferred adoption. They would adopt somebody and make them their son, and that's how they inherited it. That's Octavian's a good example, later became Augustus. The military, however, thought that the best way to pick the leader was through, biological succession from, say, Scipio, or one famous general in the past, Caesar, and that kind of thing. And they would fight to make that person the rightful heir. The Senate believed that they should vote for the person they thought should be. So you had 3 different political systems, all kind of like 3 gears kind of working against each other. And Diocletian decided to end all that and create a thing called tetrarchy. Now, I don't want to focus on this slide. I just want to jump to this map because this is important for Constantine. Because what he does is he divides the empire into 4. So we had triumvirates. And by the way, the essays on the triumvirates, so good so far. Keep that up. But I won't make you write on tetrarchy. This is just an interim phase. But when Diocletian leaves, he leaves 4 emperors in control, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior emperors, as we've talked about. Okay, fine, except for one problem. As soon as Diocletian's gone, these 4 that he left behind kind of followed the thing that was Alexander told his generals, to the strongest. They wanted to be Diocletian and take over. They weren't willing to rule over a quarter of the empire and deal with problems in that section and work together on, bigger invasions and things. They didn't want to cooperate. And so we then get Constantine. Now, we already talked about how he needed Christian warriors, Christian soldiers to win. So he legalized Christianity when he took over the empire in the Edict of Milan in 313. And then he goes on to make it the official religion of Rome, Christianity. Okay, well, listen, he fights some big battles. We're not going to talk too much about that. But what we do want to do is look at this symbol here. You see this symbol? This is the symbol for Christianity in Greek. It's not a cross like you'd see in the Western Latin church. But if you go to the Greek church, basically, you're taking 2 of the first 2 letters for Christos, or Christ, in the Greek alphabet, X and P, and you're putting them together. So when you see that symbol, everybody see that symbol? Wouldn't it be fun to put that in a study guide and say, hey, what's this the symbol of? And see what happens, see if somebody gets it right. Okay, so you got chi and rho, right? And this is used as the symbol of Christianity by Constantine I, Constantine the Great. Then, of course, he transforms Rome by moving his capital to Byzantium, which later then bore his name, city of Constantine, Constantinople. And basically everything's different. The empire now is splitting apart, in part because it had been split by Diocletian, but then also too is that the Western half is really getting pummeled. There's not the money and ability of the Roman Empire to field the legions, to man the walls, literally man the walls. They built walls out here to protect the Danube River, this natural border, from assault. So what we get is this, and this is a very intriguing map, and this is the beginning of the medieval period. So this is the fall of the West. What you have are these different tribes that come in and set up their own kingdoms. Now, remember when I say Italy, you think, oh, Italians, they were Romans. No, they weren't. Yeah, there's nobody in Italy that was, can really trace back to original Romans, right? Romulus and Remus. No, because they were invaded so many times and so many people came in. So Italy itself is a very different thing. It became part of the Ostrogothic kingdom, right? And then we have the Saxons who invade England, and the Celts are pushed back into Ireland and Scotland and Wales. And these Jutes and Saxons and Anglos were tribes from this region, which creates modern England. England, Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, pushing out the Celts and the Romans and creating new kingdoms of their own. The Franks did the Frankish kingdom and the Visigoth kingdom. There was also a group called Basques and some others. There's these little tiny things. These are the Alemanni. This is a tribe that moved in there. Oh yeah, that's the origin of the word Germany. Burgundy, or the Burgundian kingdom, right? That's a region now in Germany, in present day Germany. Slavic peoples are interesting. Slavics people are basically Middle Eastern, and Eastern European, and also the Russians. The Russians mostly are Slavic peoples. Some of them are Vikings, the Rus, the red people, the Vikings that came in and established authority, but the average people that they conquered, so to speak, were Slavic. And the Romans fought so many battles against the Slavs for the sole purpose of getting slaves. And that's the origin of the word slaves, comes from the word Slavic. So they captured so many Slavs, made them slaves. That's what we call slaves to this day. The Vandals, look at their kingdom down here. They took these islands, right? They basically became the new Carthaginian Empire. So now we have a breaking down of the empire. And that's when the economy really falls on the rocks. If you think we've got tough economic problems right now in the United States for the next year or so, well, that isn't anything like happens here. This goes on for 500 years. It takes them 500 years to get the economy back to what it was under Rome. Now, in this part, it's a different story. It's called Byzantium. Now, they would have called themselves Romans. They would not have used this term. It's a modern term that historians have labeled to differentiate from the old Roman Empire. But the Byzantine Empire is centered in Constantinople, a city that is virtually impregnable. 26 massive armies were outside its walls, 26 failed over a 1,000-year period. The Byzantines managed to hold up. Notice they have Athens in here. They have Egypt, of course, all the wealth coming from Egypt. And so this was the wealthy part of the empire, and it just jogged along quite nicely for a while. But even it's going to start to have troubles, right? Because over time, a lot of its territory, let's look at back to the map, all of this will be taken by Muslims, the Arabs. And then the Turks will come in, and then pretty soon they'll be whittled down, and it will get smaller and smaller and smaller until Byzantium is just like a postage stamp of what it was. So it loses a lot of its wealth, and with its wealth, its ability to hire mercenary troops to defend itself. And that's why the Turks were able to finally take it. Plus, they were very clever and did a lot of great things in terms of warfare. All right, now, that's kind of the end of Rome. So with that collapse, then, what does Western Europe turn into? Well, it turns into what we call the medieval period. Now, the medieval period includes also the rise of Islam in the Middle East. So at the same time, this area is breaking Europe, Western Europe, is breaking into little tiny kingdoms with a very different lifestyle, very different way of living, very different order of society. The Arabs are establishing another empire, which will be as bigger than Rome in terms of land area. Islam springs out of the Middle East starting in 611. By 622, it's a formal religion. There's a little civil war here between Mecca and Medina. The Medina wins under Muhammad, and they then convert this region. And then the four successors to Muhammad in the next 100 years take over all of this area in blue, which puts a lot of pressure on Byzantium. They lost Egypt. They lost the Fertile Crescent. They lost this part of the Middle East. They are now pushed here to a smaller and smaller area. the tenacity of Constantinople to hold out against Muslim attack, Arab attack, in this case, and later Turkish attack, was remarkable. How they held out, I don't know, but they did stop the advance of Islam further from this direction into Europe. The invasion of the Muslims continued through to Spain. They beat the Visigoths, took over the Visigothic kingdoms, but yet were unable to take France. An army led by Charles Martel, a king. Charles the Hammer, literally, that's what it's translated as. A heavy cavalry managed to defeat a small skirmish force of light cavalry coming from Spain and pushed them across this mountain range right here called the Pyrenees. And then a few Christian kingdoms at the top end of Spain began the Reconquista, where our story started, because it was the Reconquista that reconquered Spain for Isabella and Ferdinand. And it was Isabella la Católica, under the Catholic banner, that after a 700-year war, 750-year war, was then able to boot the Muslims out and then send Columbus on his voyage the same year in 1492. So you see, now we've kind of come full circle. So now the Arab Empire is growing like gangbusters. They are making money hand over fist. They're trading with China. They're trading with India. They're trading all the way across from Spain through Arabia. They have all the advantages of empire. In fact, Baghdad became the biggest city in the world at the time, had about 100,000 residents. By the time Rome now is dwindling from 1 million down to 30,000, then 15,000. Paris was like 10 or so. London was 10, 15, that was it. So this is also where they established a university and whatever. So the Arab Empire right here that you see in blue goes through a glorious period. And there's other pressures too, though. There's pressures coming from, well, the area where the Huns came from. There's the Umayyads. There's the Abbasids. There's the Mongol invasion. You see this bill in red? Watch this patch in red. The Huns had come from the same region earlier in history. These are horse archers. These are people nomadic that take their large herds of horses and go on the warpath and travel great distances. They actually forage for food. They don't have pack trains or anything like that. They don't burden themselves by that. They ride on horseback. If they get hungry and they have to, they just bleed their horses and drink the blood out of some of their horses. And the horses, of course, graze and whatever. And they hated civilization. This group of people thought civilization, what a waste of time. You see all those peasants and serfs working in the fields. To them, they were nothing more than animals, beasts of burden. What they wanted to do was get rid of civilization and just let the grass grow so that the herds could get bigger and bigger. And they literally believed that their kingdom was the entire earth. You've heard a name, Genghis Khan. Well, Genghis Khan's empire will be this in red. Watch out how it grows. Takes over China, Mongolia, most of the steppes region, pushes into Muslim territory and even into Europe. Then it broke apart. But when it was at its height, it was bigger than the Arab Empire, the Roman Empire, any of the Chinese empires, on and on and on. But it was a different sort of empire. And then when the leader dies, it kind of all collapses again. But this was called by the Muslims the Great Catastrophe. It happens around the same time, the Mongol invasion, as the Crusades coming out of Europe. The Crusades was a minor irritation to the Muslim empire, which was so vast and wealthy. This was scary. They call it the Great Catastrophe because these people didn't care about civilization. They would literally annihilate and slaughter entire towns and cities and everybody in it. They were facing that and they were losing. Horse archers, wow, they are the most advanced military of their time, and nobody really could stand up against them. The Romans, of course, had learned how to fight that way. That's why Byzantium, for a while, held on against like Attila the Hun and so on. But they ruled China. They ruled the Middle East. They ruled all the way here. There was a Russian army that went 100,000 strong, knights in shining armor, go out to face these guys. Small group, 30,000 against 100,000. 30,000. They just ran up to him, started shooting a bunch of arrows. Then they backed up and they retreated. Well, the Russian knights thought, we got him. So they started marching toward him as fast as they could. And they just strung him out. And then the entire force of horseback riders enveloped them, encircled them, never got close, hardly took any casualties, and literally wiped out the entire 100,000 man force. This was the great catastrophe for the Arab Empire. Now, the Turks would follow. Another group of horse archers from the steppe regions would follow that. And it was eventually the Turks that would settle down here in a place called Anatolia. And they would be the ones that would eventually topple the last bit of Rome, Byzantine Empire. Again, Baghdad becomes the great cultural center of the world at the time. And 100,000 people, Rome, London, Paris, even Constantinople had slid to 300,000. So we see that there's a lot of political change. So Rome falls into political and social instability. And so from the year about 200 to 800, it's not like it happened all on one day. It kind of happens a century at a time, right? And then you get the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Celts in Western Europe. You get attacks from the Muslims on one side. You get attacked from the steppe archers at another. And then the worst thing that could have happened, the weather cools. You talk about climate change. Well, there's been climate change throughout history. In this case, it gets colder in Europe. What does that mean? It means there's shorter growing seasons, so there's a food shortage. People during that time period, that 500, actually grew shorter because of malnutrition. We've seen this happen in North Korea. North Korea lives in this brutal dictatorship. It's just horrible. And food has always been a problem. And literally, the Koreans, their cousins in the South, are about an inch taller than they are because of chronic malnutrition for the last 50 years among the general population. And that kind of is what happens here. And so it's during this time, too, where we get a series of plagues. Now, you guys are sitting there, you're facing one right now. You're dealing with the plague of a century. And I am just so grateful, as I hope all of you are, to our healthcare workers who are totally slammed and swamped today. Our hospitals are so full. We don't have staff. The staff is getting sick. They're doing everything they can. But guess what? Without them, we could have the same type of casualties we saw with the Great Plague 100 years ago. We have oxygen. We have ventilators. We have therapeutics. None of that would have existed in the time of Justinian. Justinian was a truly great emperor in the Byzantine Empire, right? The end of the Roman Empire. He redid the law codes and all sorts of things, and he held Byzantium together for a long period of time. But there was a plague that came called Justinian's plague, and it hit Constantinople, and it just terrorizes the population. And they don't have any way to deal with it. They probably didn't understand social distancing. They probably didn't have masks on, who knows, but it wiped out half the population. So we've seen plagues before. That's why we take them so seriously. That's why we mask up, because we know what to do because of history. Justinian's plague would weaken Constantinople. And then watch what happens here. There's another great plague, which is called the bubonic plague, the Black Death, which happens around the year 1300. And what happens is it appears that the Black Death, the bubonic plague, came on rats. There's a little mite that lives on the rats, and it carries it. And so what happens when the rat dies, they jump to whoever host they can find, and then they pass this plague on. And it probably came from the Silk Route from China. That sound familiar? You see these arrows? Because we first see this plague hit Constantinople, but it came by sea through the Silk Route. By the time it gets to Europe, right, in these Italian states that are doing trade with Byzantium, wow, things are really starting to happen, and people are really starting to pass away quickly. It was here in Venice where they invented the word quarantine. Any ship coming into their city, any ship had to be quarantined, which means 3 months. They had to sit out there for 3 months to make sure that nobody on the ship had the plague, because that would be long enough for them to have the symptoms, either live or die. And they would be able then to bring a ship full of goods in. It's called quarantine, invented by the Venetians. We still do it today. So they understood quarantine. The wealthy noblemen would often go to their houses in the countryside to try to get away from it. But notice what happens. In a year, look at the area in green that was hit by this plague. And it took about half the population. And then in yellow, oh my goodness. And then a year later, it gets to the purple region. And then a year later, it gets here. There were people living in rural areas in the United States that thought, oh, the virus is a city thing. It's where people live together in high concentration. Sure enough, that's where it starts. It's kind of like these little orange areas, but it will spread. There was one section right here that was relatively unaffected in the area which we now call Poland. But beyond that, look at that. There was a place here in London, just outside of London, called Blackheath. Still to this day, it's a big park, big open area. And they don't build on it because this is where they put the tens and tens of thousands of bodies of people that died and buried them there. And now it's like a big park called Blackheath for the Black Death. So we live in a lucky time, as unfortunate as sometimes we feel things with our own issues, with our own having to wear masks and whatever. We have tools that they never had in the ancient times. And so we take these diseases, which have always affected mankind, we take them now and we can create vaccines now in less than a year. Can you imagine if they could have had that ability back in ancient Rome and in ancient medieval period? We are so lucky. But we have to protect our healthcare workers by wearing masks and doing our part. Every single one of us has got to do that. Kind of with that, I'm going to escape out a little bit because we now, of course, had a new president elected, and we should kind of acknowledge that a little bit more as we get the final results in. Let's see if I can get to it really quick. Today's lecture, I think, was here, wasn't it? Yeah, it's this one. Okay, so let me escape out and get back to it, because I do want to put this. I think you already answered this question though on the test, right? How big was Biden's victory? And so I'm going to go to that right now. He won by over 6 million votes. It was a colossal big win for Joe Biden. And he will be the next president. And he's putting his new government together. And his number one priority is to beat this virus. And he'll take office in 51 days. And we can put the past 4 years behind us in the rearview mirror and look to new leadership. And one of the things he did was he took the time to record a Thanksgiving message of hope and unity to the nation, asking us to pull together at this time of sacrifice and not tear each other apart. Let's go ahead and listen to the next president of the United States.
And the families who love them as well. We're thankful for everyone who met this moment with kindness, bringing groceries to neighbors or asking, how can I help? For every small business owner who put their employees and their communities before themselves. So many people are celebrating this year, knowing that someone they love will never again take their seat at the table. Joe and I know the pain of that empty chair. If you are one of those families, please know that our hearts are with you and that you know that you aren't alone.
We might not be able to join our hands around a table with our loved ones. We can come together as a nation. I know better days are coming. I know how bright our future is. I know the 21st century is going to be an American century. History has shown, and all of you have shown, that there's nothing we can't do if we do it together.
We are so grateful for all of you. From our family to yours, happy Thanksgiving.
God bless you.
And that right there is what we normally expect from our presidents, and that leadership and that caring and that bringing us together for common purpose. And it's just nice to turn the page and move forward, facing this pandemic together and everybody doing their part. And it's at this time, where we've gone through 4 years of people battling each other. We've even turned wearing masks, doing just the basic things to protect everybody's lives, turned it into a political issue. And there was never any reason for that. And that, thank goodness, we're past that point, and we can now all pull together, do the right thing, help our hospitals, especially here in Utah. They're way over jammed. You might not think, hey, I'm not sick. I'm not going to, why do I need to wear a mask? Wear it anyway. You never know. And at least you're setting an example for others who might actually be carrying the virus. We had a bit of a shock this morning as we got up. We got a call. We have some roof tiles that all need to be torn off and fixed. It's all outdoor work. So, and they wear masks when they come. But they called us up and said, guess what? Part of our crew came down with coronavirus. And so we got a quarantine for a couple of weeks, and we just hope they all get better. And we've gotten to know them. They've had to fix roofs all over the neighborhood. We had a big windstorm come through and cause some damage. And so the thing is that, we're hopefully all in it together, right? And when you go back to the plagues of ancient time, look, they did not have the advantages that we've got. The mass communication to share with everybody what we should do, sharing the idea. The problem is that when this Justinian's plague hit, people just thought, they weren't looking at the science. They were just looking at, why do these bad things happen that we can't explain? Basically, they're living in a world that's very superstitious by our standards. And we have a lot of people that still kind of adopt that mindset. It's like, well, it's not my problem, and if they don't understand the science themselves, they just don't accept the science. But at any rate, here's the thing: the Christian in Christianity, the plague, the Justinian's plague that we talked about, was seen as divine retribution from God, and it's a punishment. Ugh. Right? Because they didn't have any way to explain it. It was a result of the Christian church's belief, and it begins this kind of whole process of changing the church. Basically, they were fighting amongst themselves as to what their beliefs were. And so they thought that fighting, whether they should, it's a whole thing called iconography. This is a long discussion we don't have time for, but they were battling themselves. In Islam, though, the same thing, basically said it was totally the will of God and there was no escaping it. And the plague is seen as God's way of sending infidels to the wrong place, okay, the bad place. Okay, all that's kind of mixed up thinking, right? We just have to pull together, and everybody's got to do the right thing. Okay, so now let's get back to Western Europe, the rise of Western Europe. So where Rome fell, what is going to, over about the next 1,000 years, what is going to replace it by the time we get to Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama? Okay, first of all, Western Europe has some of the same advantages Greece did. Look at the oceans and coastline. Look at how ragged and jagged it is. This means this is going to be a seafaring continent. The continent of Europe, seafaring. I mean, look at the Vikings up through here. I mean, what other choice did they have but to build boats and get out into the ocean, right? They didn't have any. England, for heaven's sakes, is an island. Look at the coastline of France and Spain, my gosh. And look at Italy. So in a way, like Greece, ancient Greece had all these islands and all these peninsulas and whatever. It forces them to the sea. They also have these long navigable rivers, like the Rhine River, the Danube River. This is very helpful, right? To have these long rivers. Then they had mountain passes for sure, but they were always accessible. There was a way to get over them. Look at where Hannibal even crossed the Alps, right? There was always a way to get around it. So there wasn't, a lot of obstacles to trade and so on. And then here's the other thing. Very fertile land. Europe is very fertile and it's well watered. They get a lot of good rain. It might be way high in the north. For example, if you're in England or Scotland in the middle of the summer, the sun hardly ever sets. It's kind of at the same latitude of Alaska. So why is the climate so temperate? Well, it's because of the Gulf Stream. Warm waters in the Gulf heat up and move north and hit Europe and creates this more moderate climate. The Mediterranean climate down here is a lot like Southern California. And in Southern California, you can grow anything. So they also have a lot of minerals, a lot of mines and that kind of thing in the mountains that they have. And it's got a great climate. So there's 6 reasons why Western Europe has advantages that are going to allow it to transform itself into what it is today. Then you got this Roman-based Christian church, which provided some social, political, and economic structure to basically a lot of different kingdoms. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. The Bishop of Rome gradually grows to become the Holy Father or the Pope and the head of this large church apparatus, which has bishops and archbishops all the way through Europe, Western Europe. Of course, in the Byzantine Empire, very different. It's the Orthodox Church, and they have the same structure, and they've schismed. Remember, they split, right? But in the West, this church offers stability. Look at this crowd just to hear the Pope come out and give a talk on Easter, usually. This is amazing, right? So this unifying effect. The papacy, or the Pope in Rome, the Vatican here's St. Peter's, created an independent church not controlled by any one government. Now that's interesting. So the Roman Catholic Church isn't controlled by the French king, isn't controlled by the Spanish king, isn't controlled. It's its own entity. It actually creates its own little country there for a while. So it's able to exert power and influence even over kings. They can pull their support from kings. Whoa. They can crown kings. Starts with Charlemagne. The church became an independent source of authority, trying to basically teach people to be good, essentially. So this is a very important thing. And within the church, you have lots of different things happen. For example, there's a group called monks, which originally were just lonely hermits, but they joined together into monasteries. And so we get different orders of the Catholic Church, for example. You get the Benedictines, you get the Jesuits, and you get all these different monasteries. And these then provide some more structure and some more economic power to what had been a failed economy. They also provide the church social services. They give shelter to travelers. They give emergency food. They collect clothing. In fact, the second biggest charitable organization in the world today is Catholic Charities. The biggest are Muslim charities. Muslim charities are just huge, right? The Muslims are very, very generous in terms of charity. Now, women joined convents and served lives of service and prayer. So now you got this society, you got the kingdoms, you got all this kind of stuff, you got the barons, you got the peasants, you got the serfs, you got the political stuff. But then you have this church, which has monasteries and convents and churches built all over Europe, which is independent of all that. Monastic life, living as a monk, right, created a kind of a new culture. Their definition of work was to pray. Of course, they would, grow food and help the poor and all that kind of stuff. But prayer was a big part of it. You wake up, say your prayers. You say your prayer, you work the crops. And then you create intellectual labor by translating manuscripts and copying the Bible by hand because there was no printing press. So all of this, they had to get skins and take the skins and prepare them, and then take the precious skin, and you had to then do Bibles on it. The place of learning everywhere else in Europe, the literacy rate disappeared. In the Romans, a lot of people could read Greek and all this kind of stuff. Literacy went to almost zero among the average people of Western Europe, but not in the monasteries. There was one monastery in Germany that had 8,000 different books, all hand copied. Wow. They used kind of a parchment or a pergamum, basically that was not paper. Okay, different sorts of things that they wrote on. And one of the good parts about some of the things they wrote on is it would last a long time, right? It was hard to manufacture, made things expensive. It wasn't until the Chinese invention of paper and then the improvements that the Muslims made that made paper very, very cheap, did we start to move to paper just about the time the printing press came about. Now, here's the other thing. Manual labor gained respect it didn't have in the classical world. Labor was done by slaves. These guys are saying, I'm a monk, I'm a priest, I should do manual labor willingly, working with your hands as well as your heart. And this is really important because you see a lot of people today, religious people, and they believe in work and do God's work at the same time. Kind of a hard work ethic, kind of like the Puritans would bring to America when they came the Calvinists we talked about earlier. Romans didn't think that way. Manual labor was for slaves and the poor. If you were rich, you ordered people to do the work, or you paid them because you were so wealthy to do the work. So this is a change, a big one, and in this case, I think a rather good one. All right, so we move along. Here's a monastery that was, built in Spain. It was just pretty impressive stuff, right? So they would build this all themselves by hand. They were great artists too. I've seen murals and things, even in the New World, where these monasteries would, it was just amazing decorations. The gardening in the plaza, places for contemplation. They would grow food and for themselves and for others and that kind of thing. Now, the Christians would seek to convert non-believers. So basically the job was go out, and those Germanic tribes that just invaded, well, many of them were still pagan, right? So the idea was to convert them. By the year 600, Pope Gregory began turning pagan worship sites into churches rather than destroy them. So in other words, instead of going into a Germanic tribe and say, you can't do this anymore, this is evil, this is wrong, they said, oh, that's interesting. Why don't we take your holiday of the Yuletide and merge it with Christmas and Saturnalia, and we'll kind of do it all at the same time. So the gift giving and the things you do, the Christmas trees and all that, these are pagan customs that came into Christianity that we celebrate today at the holiday times. Our Christmas celebration, for those that are Christian, is a merger of pagan practices mixed with Christian ones. The idea of gift giving was a Roman thing. The idea of a Christmas tree was a Germanic thing. So you kind of look at the history of all this, and it's really interesting how they didn't ask people to completely sacrifice their culture and what they'd done their whole lives and what the celebrations they were used to, but to convert them into Christian celebrations. That's pretty slick trick there, pretty good one. And it worked well for everybody. It is certainly impossible to eradicate all errors from obstinate minds at a stroke. And whoever wishes to climb to the mountaintop climbs gradually, step by step, and not in one leap, according to Pope Gregory I around the year 600. So let's take it a step at a time here. And so that was probably why the Roman Catholic Church was so successful, is they gradually brought people along, right? Okay, an example, the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Kent, which was a little part of England. They basically took a worship site for the people living there, the Anglo-Saxon, and turned it into Canterbury, which became the headquarters of the Church of England. And it's a beautiful cathedral built upon once was a pagan worship site. All right, now, then you get these missionaries. Boniface was probably the most important. He's a Benedictine monk who made many journeys, many travels to Germany just to win converts. And when he came, he was dressed in very ordinary attire, just very humble, hardworking, willing to help. He wasn't better than anybody else. So they would listen to him. You get in Ireland, for example, you get a guy, basically St. Patrick, who goes and converts Ireland. Ireland became Christian before England did. They became Roman Catholic and remained that way even to this day, right? The first recorded missionary to Ireland was this guy, Palladius, who was probably from Gaul, which was France. In other words, he got on a little boat and kind of took the trip over. He's sent by the Pope, the Pope to be bishop of Irish who believe in Christ. And then the most famous missionary that came along a little later was St. Patrick, as we talked about. He was born in Roman Britain, St. Patrick was, son of a wealthy official. So yeah, and he was kidnapped by an Irish raiding party and sold into slavery into Ireland as a kid. Now, as Roman Britain collapsed, it was increasingly common for Irish, the Picts, which came from the north, I think Scots, and Saxon raiders to pillage the coastline and settlements, whatever. And he discovered God during his captivity and took to praying 100 times a day. He just was there 6 years, and they finally escaped, made a 200-mile escape along the east coast and negotiated passage back to France, which was Gaul, and then he trained to be a Christian priest. So 6 years in captivity led him to God, and that allowed him then to be trained And then he received a dream. He said the people of Ireland in the Western Sea had called him to come back and walk among them again. And he traveled to Ireland as a missionary. The year traditionally is 432 for that date, but it's probably more like 460. But that's how the Irish converted to Catholicism. And oh, by the way, Joe Biden is Irish, and that's where he gets his Catholicism. So that's another reason why I showed you that little clip today of the next president. Notice how the past, St. Patrick's story, leads to the unlikely story of Joe Biden, who's only the second Catholic president in American history. So these are interesting stories. All these things are happening in Western Europe, right? Now, there's these Benedictine monks who I talked about earlier. They made several trips to Germany to win converts. And they would actually start by converting the leaders, and the leaders would see advantages to the whole system. So they would encourage their folks to listen. Christians blended German values and practices into their religion. For example, Germans emphasized the presence of gods in nature and set up shrines in the woods where they could be worshiped, right? So Christians changed the special places where they would pray, particularly holy men, whatever, but they would use those same places. And so they also took some of these people that merited special attention and made them saints. So they weren't lost to the new converts. Have you guys ever heard of Santa Claus? There you go. So we have all of these kinds of things. The Germans used to wear these amulets, like bracelets and stuff, and they wore charms, usually like a little bag of, what do we call it? Herbs and spices, that kind of thing, and wear those to ward off evil, right? And early Christians began wearing metal around their necks, honoring Jesus and his mother. Oh, this is when they started to wear crosses on their necklaces. So they kind of borrowed an idea and kind of made it their own. Christian knights were a warrior class, but they would actually be promoted by the church, and many of them then became the noblemen who provided safety and security in the area, and created what we now call feudalism, which is a very important term for this section of the lecture. What is feudalism? It's weak central monarchy ruling over small states, basically influential families who ruled these small areas. Now, they may work in conjunction with a more powerful noble who may even be called a king, but they were essentially pretty independent, right? The ruler was called Lord, like Lord God. That seems like a pretty lofty title to me. It seems a little bit hubris, a little bit arrogant, but that person was the Lord in the area. So in a sense, it's kind of maybe an extension of that deification thing. And everybody under this Lord was called a vassal. And the nobles were lords over the common people. Kind of like God ruled over man. This is kind of how it would play out. And the people working for a nobleman, working for the lord of the manor, the lord of the area, they would call him my lord. This would persist for hundreds of years. You had to pay homage to them and donate certain labor and services to them and pay them taxes and grind your grain in their granary, and only could fish with their permission from their fish ponds. And when they asked you to serve in the military, you had to serve in the military. So by controlling all the land, they became the lord of that land. And everybody else was a vassal. So here is the medieval setup. You ready? So you have the Lord, and he had knights who provided military protection, but also they were kind of like the local police, if you will. Move this out of the way so you can see this chart. Now, you had legal system. Basically, the church provided that. And then basically what happens is vassals would provide the food. They would produce the food, which then paid the military, which kept the councils alive, which paid taxes, which created this circular effect of an economy between the Lord, the military protection, and the peasants. And it was this circular effect called feudalism in a local area. The church, of course, stepped in when it needed to provide a common religious set of values and also to intercede if there was need for a trial. Now this chart right here, let's talk about the Vayins. Basically, these are the people, the villains, if you will, basically the poor class, the people, the peasants, the serfs, right? Okay, so the king, right, would give power to these local barons, these lords, right, who had their knights, who controlled the population. The population provided food and services. Then they also would turn into the military for the barons, who would then often provide money and military strength to the king. This essentially is feudalism. So a couple of little pictures here, a couple of little charts side by side, and you see this structure is not Rome. This is not an empire. The economic system is often called minoralism. Forget this other term, it's just tricky, but nevertheless, here's minoralism. Legal and economic power rested in the local lord, and the obligations of serfs and peasants to pay labor, which the French called corvée, rarely money. It was mainly, food, wheat, things that they did. And they would work certain parts of land just for the nobleman, and they would build a nobleman's castle for him. Okay, so that's kind of how it got set up. So you would live on this person's land. He would have the big house. You would live in little villages in this little area called minoralism.
Like 1 minute left.
Oh, 1 minute left. And so what it is, it turns out to be a big, huge protection racket. So that's probably the place to stop right there, giving you a feeling of what it meant to be in the medieval period of history. It was a big come down from Rome, trust me. All right, so stopping there. I'm going to go ahead and get this one converted for the home classes. So this will take a minute.